now begin our public proceedings of the Education Select Committee, and this morning we have a scrutiny session on the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill. Can I welcome our witnesses and committee members to our session this morning? I'll start by asking our witnesses to introduce yourselves to us, starting with Kate Anstey.
Yeah, good morning. My name's Kate Anstey and I'm Head of Education Policy at Child Poverty Action Group.
Rebecca.
Hi, I'm Dr. Rebecca Montague. I'm Acting Director of Research and Policy at the Sutton Trust. I also just need to declare that I was a Labour parliamentary candidate at the last election, but at the Trust we're completely apolitical and work across the political spectrum.
Thank you. Lindsay MacDonald.
Hello, Dr. Lindsay MacDonald, Chief Executive of Magic Breakfast.
Thank you very much. We're going to start by considering the commitment in the bill to deliver universal breakfast clubs. Can I ask what challenges you foresee in the rollout of breakfast clubs across the country, and in particular whether there are considerations that the government should be making around how to make sure that breakfasts are genuinely nutritious for all children? Perhaps starting with you, Lindsay.
Yes, thank you. So I think Magic Breakfast delivers breakfast clubs and a range of models of providing breakfast to hungry children and young people each and every morning. About 300,000 children this morning had access to a Magic Breakfast. And I think the challenges that we foresee, given the current shape of the bill, is that you're limiting and stifling innovation and schools to take the context that they operate within. So a traditional breakfast club, is a wonderful soft start to the day. It offers that childcare opportunity for parents, and it also offers the opportunity for socialization. But some of the children and young people that I believe this bill is most intending to support, those who are at risk of hunger at the start of the school day, whose families may be experiencing poverty, who may also have food insecurity, may struggle to access a before breakfast provision. So our clear advice and the model that we operate, and on which a lot of the evidence that is being cited is built upon, is a mixed model approach. And that starts to enable you to overcome some of the challenges that the traditional breakfast club may introduce. So options would be classroom provision, where you actually make use of the existing staffing, so that provides the suitable ratio if you did truly capture all of the children and young people in a particular school to be able to access breakfast. There are also frameworks such as nurture groups, which are particularly beneficial to children and young people who may have SEND. And then there are also, obviously the requirement to provide a late provision for those children who may struggle even to reach school in time for the school bell. I think challenges become more acute and more concerning and actually quite stigmatizing when you look at special schools. And we've made several recommendations in our written evidence to the committee around some of the considerations that we think the committee should take in. From a nutrition perspective, I think the school food standards, separate to this bill, should be reviewed and looked at and considered. I think as well the advice and support that needs to be provided to head teachers, school business managers, to school leaders to understand actually what those school standards mean in the context of providing breakfast to ensure it's as nutritious as possible is really important. And again, a key recommendation we've made is to offer expert advice and support for that impactful scaling up. But when you get into the delivery and the provision, and I'm sure there will be bumps along the road in terms of, through the early adopter scheme, some learning opportunities, but you can also provide food products that are more nutritious, that children find appealing, by introducing, for example, higher fibre bagels. So we have a partnership currently where we provide higher fibre bagels and nutritiously sound breakfast cereals, for example, having the different support and equipment grants that we really welcome in the early adopter scheme for schools means that they can also offer hot foods, so porridge, baked beans, providing that protein required as well. So I think the challenges can be overcome, but the bill in its current form isn't allowing that flexibility, and it's also not monitoring and measuring to allow that flexibility to be understood. Is it having the impact? Is it reaching the children and young people that it needs to?
Thank you. Rebecca.
Yeah, I'd say I agree with much of what's been said. I think just to pick up on a few other potential, opportunities and also challenges. I think the fact that the provision is universal is in many ways very helpful for something that starts before the school day, so that you don't have potential stigma if you were targeting, say, specific low-income families in any kind of provision, for them to come in earlier and it kind of be seen that they are accessing that support. I think having it be universal means that you are avoiding that challenge. I think one of the issues definitely will be whether or not it ends up being adequately funded, and obviously we'll have to see through the pilot what is needed in the schools who are delivering that provision. But, you know, we've been highlighting for a long time that some specific funds that are meant to be for disadvantaged children, things like pupil premium, actually are ending up being used plugging holes elsewhere in a school's budget. And if this is a required thing for schools to then provide and isn't resourced properly, there is the risk that they might end up eating into other budgets where they do feel like they've got more ability to push that funding elsewhere, that could have unintended consequences. And that will be really important for for people to keep an eye on basically throughout the rollout. And also the question on quality. There's obviously an issue around normal free school meals and whether or not they're high enough quality nutritionally, whether or not schools are able to afford the highest quality food, and making sure that that is what students are getting. And again, that will need to be examined. I'd also be very interested if Lindsay's ever looked at issues around kind of making sure that they've got transport to be able to get there earlier if that is required as well. Especially if you're looking at like more rural areas where they might need to travel further to be able to get to the school, and better off families will be more likely to have access to a car, perhaps be able to drop their kids in earlier. So just to flag that as a few potential concerns. I'd also say we really welcome any addition to food that is getting to kids, because we do know that there are lots of kids coming into school who are hungry. Breakfast is a really positive part of that, but we do also think that there are other things that should be done, like, for instance, looking at expanding who is eligible for free school meals. The eligibility threshold for that hasn't risen adequately with inflation over time. And actually, we know that 1 in 6 families who are eligible for universal credit are living in food insecurity at the moment. Our recommendation for free school meals, because you don't have the same issues for stigma as kids are already there in the school day, they can access it with a prepaid card, so no one has to know that their free school meal is free, that actually you should target the investment for those families on universal credit to make sure that kids have the food that they need to get all through the school day, so both breakfast and going later on.
Thank you. Kate?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I suppose just to say at Child Poverty Action Group, we do a huge amount of research with children and families about school life to understand kind of what makes a difference. I think it's important to say we do really welcome the Breakfast Club policy. We know that done well, it can make a big difference to all families, but particularly those living on a low income. We know it can support families in terms of work and children at the start of the day in terms of that kind of school readiness. We know that lots of schools already have breakfast provision. I think around 75% of schools already have some form of breakfast provision, but that is a real mixture in terms of how that's delivered and also how that's paid for. In primary schools, lots of parents are paying towards that. In secondary schools, as Rebecca said, sort of pupil premium funding is often going towards that. So I think this policy is important to sort of help schools have a standardised approach or support more schools to be able to fund this provision. But I think, as Rebecca said, we are also really concerned about the long-term kind of funding plan for this. At the moment, there is that money assigned for the early adopters. Of course, that's a test and learn period to see how that works and whether that funding is sufficient. But I think what can't happen is after the early adopter phase that it's then passed on to schools to fund that provision. We know that schools would go above and beyond for families and are doing that already, but asking them to deliver another thing on top of everything else without sufficient funds is not going to work. And also we know schools will go to great efforts not to pass those costs on to families, but inevitably that can end up happening when schools simply don't have enough money. So we welcome this. I think the point on nutrition is important. I think obviously breakfast clubs have to align with the school food standards. I think there's a general consensus that those do need to be reviewed. But I do think that we have to support schools. You know, if we're telling schools that they have to meet the standards, we also have to help them in terms of the funding that goes alongside that, because as it's been said, it's not adequate at lunchtime, and schools do really struggle with kind of those meal costs. would agree with Rebecca that alongside breakfast, the free school meals piece is absolutely essential. You know, while breakfasts are important, not every child is there for breakfast club in the mornings, not everybody attends it, whereas the vast majority of children are there during the middle of the day. At the moment, 1 in 3 children in poverty, who are deemed to be in poverty, are not eligible for that free school meal. And around 1 in 10 aren't registered because of challenges around auto-enrolment. So we would absolutely feel that this is a kind of missed opportunity in this bill to not look at the free school meals policy and to ensure that free school meal is going to many more children who are struggling, and also that auto-enrolment scheme should be put in place. And that could have also been done through this bill to make sure that some of the poorest families aren't going without a school meal because of the kind of registration process.
Thank you. So I just want to build on the points that some of you have made about funding. So the policy notes to the bill state that, of course, we will provide funding to cover the new duty, including for nutritious food and staffing costs. But there will then be a process of deciding what level of funding the government allocates. I wondered, from your work, do any of you have an estimate of the cost of the national rollout of breakfast clubs, so that there is a kind of baseline against which to judge the proposal that the government comes forward with in due course? Lindsay?
I mean, our view is that, as it's currently set out, if this were solely allowed to be breakfast clubs, it is not anywhere near the sufficient level of funding that you would require because of the staffing that needs to be put in place for before school provision. Research done by the Education Endowment Foundation when reviewing the scaling up of the National School Breakfast Programme found that you could reduce costs on a per pupil basis by as much as 75% by introducing the mixed models method. So I think that is our clear steer to the committee and to those legislating the bill, that it needs to allow for beyond the breakfast club setting, because currently the funding is absolutely not anywhere near. And as colleagues have alluded to as well, schools will attempt to pick up those costs themselves, and it will be diverted from other much needed budget lines in school systems.
Either of you or both of you want to comment on that?
We don't have a cost, we don't know exactly what it would cost to roll out fully. I suppose there is just, as I say, learning from what's happening elsewhere and around costs, and also looking at the middle of the day and the fact that we know currently the money that is provided for a free school meal isn't high enough, and to just sort of take that into consideration when you're thinking about rolling out these programmes.
No, nothing to add.
Fine, lovely. In which case we'll go to Serena, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. The date for the national rollout of breakfast clubs will be given sometime this year after learning from the 750 early adopters of the scheme. How quickly could the programme be rolled out to what we've got, just under 17,000 primary schools nationally? Question to Kate?
Yeah, so as I said, the vast majority, or I think around 75% of schools already have some kind of breakfast provision in place. So this isn't totally new policy, but I think there would have to be time allowed to take the learning from the early adopters for schools to be able to share that information. But my view is that this is a policy that, in theory, if the right funding is put in place and the right money is going towards staffing, that schools would have a kind of willingness to take on. I think, just to sort of use another example, in London recently the Mayor introduced universal primary free school meals. That was announced in the kind of February time and delivered from the September. That was a huge shift and a huge kind of thing for schools to undertake, but actually what we found in an evaluation of the policy, that there was huge amounts of staff will, because they knew the impact that policy would have on children and the difference it would make. So while there was kind of problem solving, while there was sort of things that schools had to navigate, by September every school in London was delivering that universal primary provision. So I would say it's possible to do at pace if the funding is in place, and because we have amazing schools and staff that are kind of willing to make these policies happen.
Thank you. Rebecca?
The only thing I would add to that is, obviously there's pressure on one side to make sure you're taking the learnings from the pilot, communicating that information to schools, but obviously the pressure on the other side is that there are lots of kids at the moment who are coming into school without adequate food, who will be getting access to it through this scheme. So I totally agree both that, we've seen from other schemes it is possible to roll it out quickly. We need to make sure the learnings from that pilot are taken into account, but there is a pressure to make sure that those kids are getting food as quickly as possible.
So evidence from the National School Breakfast Policy highlighted that you can scale at pace with impact this type of model with the expert advice and guidance provided to schools. So I think, as colleagues have said, it's imperative the policy is rolled out nationally as quickly as possible to alleviate, every possible school day and learning hours being lost by children, who are otherwise too hungry to learn. So it absolutely can be done with the right support and funding and learning taken on board as well.
Bring in Caroline Johnson on that question before we go to Manuela.
Thank you, Chair. Just listening to what you're saying, my understanding of the policy is that its aim is to help those children who are currently coming into school not having had breakfast. Why? It seems there's two options really. One is to target the children who are not getting breakfast, look at the reasons why and try and ensure they do get breakfast. Given that we know that families eating together is an opportunity for them to talk to each other and to build relationships in that respect, why bring all children, many of whom will be getting breakfast anyway, into school for breakfast rather than target the children who are not getting breakfast?
So I think I in part covered this previously, in that I think when it is something that is outside of the normal school day, if you only target it to certain kids, you've got the danger of stigma and that people might not want to access it because they're worried about what that says about their family, that they can't afford breakfast normally, or there's some expectation from the state that perhaps they wouldn't provide that. I think making it universal means that you're avoiding that problem and also having it more likely to have take up. I would say, obviously, I do think that the government has a dual purpose in doing this, and I think they're speaking a lot about those most disadvantaged children, but it is also about childcare and providing that for a broader set of parents. I think that's a slightly different issue and, has various pros and cons to it, but I do think that's also part of the design of the policy.
Okay, so you've got two groups of people who are not giving their children breakfast, essentially. They'll broadly fall into those who are unable to because they can't afford to, or they have not got the capacity to for some reason, and those who just don't. And both groups will exist. So those who don't have the capacity, this policy will help because it'll bring these children in and they'll get their breakfast, which is really good. But those who don't, how are we going to make sure they turn up for their early breakfast? If a lot of these children don't turn up on time for school, their parents don't get up and give them breakfast, how are we going to make them get up in time for a breakfast club?
So I think this feeds into what Lindsay was saying previously about having that model, and I do think this does make sense for the delivery of the policy, where you could either have it, presumably when you first come in half an hour before the start of the school day, or that food would still be available if you came in, basically as you would normally be starting at school, so that then even if you only come in at a normal time, you could still have access to the food provision.
Finally, there's an issue of...
Caroline, I think there are other witnesses who wanted to answer your question.
Yeah, I suppose just to say that we know the mornings are a very stressful time for families. During the evaluation of the London programme families talked about it's very difficult in the mornings, getting children ready, getting out of the house on time, trying to provide food, make and manage lunches or breakfast. I think what breakfast clubs do for lots of families is they can be a good option to enable families to work, to support children at the beginning of the day with school readiness, to provide families with food. Not every family will take up that offer. I think breakfast club take up is around 40%, so there will be families that continue to have breakfast at home. But I do think it's important to acknowledge families aren't sat there. Lots of families are in very deep poverty. Lots of families are very unable to buy food and provide food. So having that breakfast club is good for them, but it's good for lots of families for a whole range of reasons.
So thank you for that. So as a mother of three who used to do medical shifts as a doctor, starting very early, I totally understand how for mothers like I was at that time, these clubs would be very, very good, but I'm not sure that they're the target that we're aiming for with the free clubs. If it's not compulsory in a rural area where the county council are providing transport to bring these children to school, will the county councils be required to provide two lots of transport, one for breakfast club and one later, or will the families be forced to take one or the other?
Lindsay, do you want to?
Yes, I suppose just to address a few of the points. So, Magic Breakfast model is to take a hunger-focused approach, which is universal, stigma and barrier-free, and that really enables, with the support and advice provided to schools, the expertise and understanding of how to understand and identify symptoms and behaviours that reflect hunger. So, to that point of, is it an either or? No, it doesn't need to be, but you need to have a hunger-focused lens applied first. In terms of the transport challenges, this is particularly acute for special schools and, as you touch on, rural schools as well. And I think, again, that's where the mixed model approach can allow both schools and local authorities to take those decisions and put in place what makes most sense in their local context as well. A crucial piece to all of this, having the flexibility, having the opportunity to address what's the purpose of the bill, is monitoring and evaluation. Currently, there's no provision within the bill for monitoring or measurement to ensure that pupil uptake is effective. And we've learned lessons in Wales where they introduced free school breakfast. They didn't have these provisions in place, and they are belatedly recognising it didn't reach the children and young people that it was intending to support in the first instance. So I think you need to enable and allow flexibility and innovation within local school contexts, provide the funding and resource to allow that to happen effectively, and monitor and measure it so that this committee and others can scrutinise the impact and ensure it really has made the difference that it really can as a policy.
Thank you. It moves on to Manuela now.
Thank you, Chair. We already heard from you about the transformative impact of auto-enrollment for free school meals and extending eligibility. So I want to go into a bit more details. So the bill does not make provision for any changes to the system of free school meals for eligible children. What difference would auto-enrollment for free school meals make to poor nutrition for some school children?
Yeah, so on auto-enrollment, as I said, this is, at the moment, there are, according to DFE data, around 1 in 10 children who are eligible for that free school meal but are not registered for it. And we know that there are a whole range of reasons for that, including the sort of admin process, families not knowing they're entitled, kind of language challenges for families. So this all plays into why they're not currently registered. Where those children, and at the moment there are lots of brilliant schemes happening at local authority level where families are being auto-enrolled or they have a sort of opt-out process. And local authorities are finding thousands of children who are in this position. They're automatically enrolling them, and then those children are getting access to that meal each day. What we know about where children can access that meal each day is that it makes a huge difference. In the sort of evaluation we did of the London policy, 1 in 3 families were saying that it was improving their child's mental health and well-being. 1 in 3 families were saying that their child was enjoying school more. A big finding that came through was that children were able to try new foods because they were sat down with their friends and teachers together. It also, we know from teachers, that has this knock-on effect in terms of the rest of the day. So concentration levels go up, the afternoon lessons are calmer. So of course, we're talking at the moment about making sure that that group that are eligible get access to it. But those benefits, we need that to go much, much wider. As I said, 1 in 3 children in poverty aren't eligible for a free school meal. As Rebecca said, that threshold is painfully low and hasn't been increased since 2018. So there is an urgent need for the government to look at the free school meals policy and make sure that many more children can benefit from having that meal each day that is totally necessary.
I'd agree with everything Kate said there, and I'd also just add that it also has knock-on effects as to the pupil premium that schools are able to access for pupils, and then wider interventions that they can then do for that group to try to tackle their attainment levels. So I would say that making sure that the kids who are eligible for free school meals are actually able to access it, and then the subsequent benefits is really important.
Magic Breakfast is, wholly in support of removing hunger as a barrier to learning, whether that's in the morning or the afternoon, and completely agree with colleagues that the whole school day needs to be considered, and a child's entire day of nutrition and opportunity to learn is incredibly important.
This question for Kate. We know that Child Poverty Action Group has called for the eligibility of criteria for free school meals to be widened, as you've just argued. sort of beyond auto-enrolment, how would you like to see eligibility for free school meals extended? Is that just to those on universal credit, or is it universal? And is there any evidence from the secondary sector, because obviously a lot of the evidence you've cited is obviously from London and primary schools, that this would make a difference? Finally, how much would it cost on your different scenarios of extension, and are there also savings?
Yeah, so Child Poverty Action Group, we're very clear that means testing should be removed entirely from the lunchtime. There's no reason why it exists at that time of the day and not anywhere else in the school day. And there's no reason children should be divided because of income at lunchtime. So we are ultimately calling for the government to work towards fully universal provision of free school meals, make it a part of the day, allow everybody to have that same experience, sit down and enjoy that together. We do recognise that there is sort of financial constraints. We do recognise that that might be more of a long-term plan. In the interim, at the moment, as we've talked about, there are many children, thousands of children who are in families in receipt of universal credit, so have been deemed kind of to need, that family has state support, and yet we haven't managed to extend that in terms of giving that child a free school meal at lunchtime. So at an absolute minimum, the government must provide free school meals to all children in families with universal credit, but we'd like to see that as a sort of working towards a universal system. In terms of the cost, we estimate it would cost around $2 billion for universal provision across all age groups, so that's primary through secondary, and that's on top of the current status quo, so on top of what's spent already. In terms of rolling out to all on universal credit, I will just check my numbers, but I believe it's around 600 million to make that extension. Yeah, so that would be an additional 1.3 million children that would be an additional 1.3 million children who would receive a free school meal as a result of that policy if everybody on universal credit received a free school meal.
Can I just add to that, we had very similar numbers in terms of the cost for extending onto universal credit. So it would benefit probably around 1 million additional children, and we had an estimate range between 360 million and 540 million, plus about 100 million for like startup capital costs to be able to help schools to be able to have, the right kind of kitchen provision available and all those sorts of things. And I'd say in the current funding environment, given it is a very high cost to make it completely universal, that's why our preference as an organisation is to focus on universal credit, because there's a lot of other issues within the school system that really need funding at the moment that I would put above universalising free school meals. But I do think in an absolute ideal scenario, it would be good to make it available to everyone, but I wouldn't say a priority.
Serena.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to consider now provisions in the bill regarding uniform requirements and particularly the cap on branded items. Do you believe that that will help the financial pressures and burdens on families, particularly those from disadvantaged and deprived areas?
Yeah, I'm sure.
Kate?
So again, at Child Poverty Action Group, we really welcome that this bill recognises the pressure that school costs put on families, and that is a real challenge for families, and it has an effect on how children experience the school day. So we welcome that there are changes being made. Uniform is a particular worry for parents. It's the cost they worry most about. It's also the cost that comes out the highest. So I've done a piece of analysis, and we estimate that primary school families are paying around £350 a year for uniform, and at secondary it's about £450 a year. So this is a real cost pressure for families. We know that where there are extensive lists of kind of branded items required, that is stressful, and often families can't meet those requirements, and that is difficult for families. So yes, we think this is a good move. We think this is a good addition to the bill. We would like to see support around uniform costs go further. In terms of the branded items, we don't understand why there's a difference or a discrepancy between primary and secondary schools. So at the moment in the bill it says 3 branded items for primary and 4 for secondary. I can't see a reason for that discrepancy, and I think the bill in general maybe overlooks secondary school pupils. So we would like to see that certainly brought in line. But going further than that, we have called for families to be given kind of grant support in terms of the cost, low-income families to be given grant support in terms of the cost of uniform. This is a policy that exists in every other UK nation. So every other, in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, families get cash support for school costs and help with uniform if they're living on a low income, and we don't have that here. So we absolutely think that should be included in this, and there should be more support. One stat that I just want to flag from DFE data is that 18% of children facing financial hardship have been sent home from school for not having the right uniform requirements. So I find this shocking that we've got a sort of attendance crisis, and at the same time children are being sent home from school because of uniform or sort of poverty related issues. So I think uniform is a barrier, and it does affect attendance, and I really do think that I'm glad to see effort being made in this bill, but I think we can go further to support families with this.
Okay, I'd like to ask Rebecca a supplementary question based on that. So in terms of reducing the expectations in terms of uniform items affecting students that have been at risk in terms of attendance, Rebecca, do you feel that that would affect standards within a school community as well?
Well, I think similarly to whether or not you get sent home from the school, if you are perhaps wearing ill-fitted uniform because your parents can't afford to size you up as you go through the school, or you're having to wear hand-me-downs that don't quite fit properly, that obviously can impact how a child feels about themselves day to day, and that will also have impacts on how they feel being able to engage with the school day as well. I also just wanted to flag an issue that I think gets less attention in this debate, which is the potential impact on the choices that parents can make about schools as well. So the Sutton Trust carried out research asking about a variety of different things that were impacting parents' decisions on where they would apply to for a school. And we found that actually for those from the lower social economic groups, 56% said that worries about extra costs in schools, including uniform, equipment, contributions to facilities, was very or fairly important as a factor in the decision of where they were applying to. So you've also got the issue of potentially cutting off certain schools for some families because they're worried about the high cost of uniform. Our actual guidance that we give to schools when we're looking at how they can improve their actual policies to become more accessible in the admission space is actually that they should have only maximum 1 item. So we do really support the efforts of this bill to try to reduce the costs, but actually it could potentially go further. 1 item of branded clothing still allows you to have a school identity, a really easy identifier, and you're still able to say that, you know, students should have black trousers. It's just the question of how many places can they buy those trousers from, and that really helps to bring down the cost.
Okay, and my final question is, how do you respond to the concerns that reducing identifiable markers of school identity could actually lead to harming some of our more vulnerable children? And I'm happy for anybody to answer that for me.
Can you just explain what you mean by harming, in what way?
Well, there has been concerns that wearing the identity of a school uniform can lead to more concerns in the public, leaving school and walking to school. Those are concerns that have been raised.
As I was going to say, I think that, you know, you can still have quite a clear visual identity for a school with very few or very limited numbers of branded specific items, and people will still be aware that, you know, the blue polo jumper is X school in the community. I think it's quite sensible potentially for local authorities to ensure that the schools are coordinating a bit with that and not having uniforms that look very similar to one another, so you can tell who's from which school, if that's helpful to say, you know, report antisocial behaviour they're seeing in the community and knowing which school to flag the issue to. But I don't think that you need a badge to be able to do that.
Yeah. No significant concerns from your evidence?
And I suppose maybe to add, we've worked with many schools. We've also worked with schools who have kind of changed their uniform policies, reduced the number of branded items. They've reported, obviously, that significantly helps families, and we haven't come across any of those concerns in our work with schools.
Thank you.
Jess.
This is questions to Rebecca. Can you explain what impact giving local authorities more control over admissions could have on the socio-economic disparities between schools?
Yeah, so when we first heard that the bill was going to be looking at admissions policies, we were quite hopeful that there could be some really positive changes, specifically looking at ensuring that local authorities are able to coordinate across a local area to ensure that there's a social economic mix of children within each school in their community, and that you don't end up with some schools in some parts of the community taking fewer than their fair share of more disadvantaged children and some taking far, far more. Now, what we've seen in the bill from the detail of it so far, there are positive moves in terms of giving local authorities more power over place planning. That's a very sensible thing, to be able to ensure their community has the right number of places. But from the detail of the bill that we've seen so far, it doesn't look like some of what we'd hoped might happen in terms of ensuring that those admissions policies were being decided at a local authority level and coordinated across a local authority, that power won't go into the local authorities, and that is a concern. In terms of multi-academy trusts, the very, very large ones actually have what we call positive free school meal gaps. So they're taking on more students eligible for free school meals than in the kind of wider area that could reasonably be called a catchment for them around them. But as you get down the track of smaller and smaller mats, they actually start getting a negative gap, so they're taking fewer than the community around them. Now, from the types of schools going into each of those types of mats, some of this is likely just kind of existing and previous inequalities going through the MAT system, as opposed to them specifically having issues within themselves. But we do think that it could be very positive to have that coordination over an area. And at the moment, there are local authorities trying to do those efforts, and they're having to really actively engage with any MATs that are in their area to try to get them on board. And it's very difficult sometimes for just a school to make a change on its own. It is about that whole community and making sure that there is better representation, because we know that a lot of the schools that have the highest rates of performance for their students actually are very socially selective and are less likely to have those free school meal students in compared to their local community. So that is something we would have really liked to have seen in the bill that hasn't been included.
Thank you. We've got two further panels of witnesses this morning, so I'm going to draw this one to a close and say thank you very much to all of you for giving your evidence to us this morning. If we just pause briefly while we change over and call in the witnesses for the second panel. Thank you. Three witnesses for our second panel this morning, and ask you all to introduce yourselves briefly, if that's okay, starting with Sam Friedman.
Hi, I'm Sam Friedman. I am a Senior Fellow at the Institute for Government, used to work at the Department for Education 2010 to 2013 as a Senior Policy Advisor when the Academy's sort of world was really expanding. And I'm also a Senior Advisor to ARC Schools, the Multi-Academy Trust, but I am here in a personal capacity, not representing them or anybody else.
Thank you. Daniel.
Hello, I'm Daniel Kebede. I'm a former teacher and I'm General Secretary of the National Education Union.
And John, thank you.
John Barnaby, I'm Chief Executive of Oasis Community Learning, and we run 54 academies across the country.
Can I say thank you to you, John, for stepping in at very short notice after a witness from another panel was taken ill. Thank you very much for being here this morning. I'm going to pass to Manuela for our first question.
Thank you, Chair. So thank you, panel. Will the provisions in the bill inhibit academies' ability to innovate and improve?
I think if we look at the last 10 years of the sector, a lot of the innovations come out of academies. It's come out of those freedoms. Those freedoms have created a culture, a leadership culture, where people can explore and experiment. I think, and there's lots of areas around curriculum, pedagogy, terms and conditions being a really key area. I think we welcome the change, the amendment to the bill that was announced last week around setting a floor rather than a ceiling. And I think what we'd like to see is all schools to have these flexibilities, not just academies, because I think that's where the innovation actually starts to happen. If we look at where we are as a sector, we're moving into really the next chapter of education in the country, where we don't need to have academies and local authority schools, where we can work in partnership at a local level to serve the communities in the best way possible. I certainly believe that some of the flexibilities that have been afforded have enabled that innovation. And we think things like National Institute of Teaching that's come out of a school-led system that is generating and training the next generation of teachers and leaders across the sector. And if you look at support staff, there's huge innovation gone on through multi-academy trusts. The IT skills that are in the sector, facilities management skills that are in the sector. And then if we look at leadership as well, that's come out of academies, the generation of systems leaders that have been created are now helping lead education forward. So I think we welcome the amendments to the bill around terms and conditions. We need to make sure we can be competitive. I think that is our biggest risk to the sector. I think we know recruitment is one of the biggest challenges. We know it's hard for the public purse to compete with the private sector, but I think we can compete on the offer. There is a sense of purpose that exists in education that attracts people to it. And I think if we can provide the right terms and conditions of flexibility for people, then they will come.
Anna.
So there's a bit of a narrative developing that it's only academies and MATs that are innovative, and I think that is something that we should absolutely reject. Some multi-academy trusts are innovative. In fact, those that operate in a local, regional area where there can be close collaboration do have lots of innovation, but also non-academised state schools also are incredibly innovative. But I think we absolutely need to consider what drives innovation. And what drives innovation is collaboration, the opportunity for peer-to-peer learning and indeed professional autonomy. Some multi-academy trusts are pretty poor at innovation, actually. If you wander around them, teachers are told what to do, when to do it. This is the academy's way. You will teach to this script and you will use this logoed PowerPoint. That isn't innovation at all.
Thank you, Sam.
I don't think it will make an enormous difference because the primary reason that multi-academy trusts work when they do is because of managers' ability to scale what works in one school across multiple other schools, and these particular freedoms can support that a bit in some cases, but it's not the main driver of improvement. And actually schools in England, all schools in England already have quite a large amount of autonomy, management autonomy compared to schools globally. That being said, it would have been good to have an explanation of what the problem was that this was trying to solve. I don't think there's any evidence that freedom over curriculum, freedom over paying conditions has made anything worse for anybody, and there are some cases where it's been used effectively by academies. So again, I would say there's no issue with aligning the two sectors, but why not do it by giving maintained schools more freedoms, or by sort of thinking about this in a broader systematic context. It just seems a bit sort of out of nowhere and lacking an explanation for the problem it's trying to solve.
Thank you. The policy notes to the bill state that repealing the compulsory conversion of failing schools to academy status will result in more flexibility. How has it helped failing schools to be compulsory converted to academies? So, John, maybe.
Well, I think, speak from experience, 41 of our 54 schools were sponsored, so they were deemed failing schools. We were 23% good or better. In 2014, we're 91% good or better now. So a significant number of schools have been approved, and I think that's a picture across a number of academy trusts through that compulsory route. I do think that there is again, a need for partnership, a need for context to be understood when making these decisions. I think there was some clarity provided yesterday about actually how Ofsted and the accountability system will link into decisions around schools being compulsory converted. I think the RISE teams are a welcome addition and create clarity around that, so we know that special measures schools are going to be effectively put up for compulsory conversion. So I think the little bit of this conversation has moved on since yesterday, but we certainly think there is a place where intervention's needed, and I think that it's important that intervention can happen.
Whilst we're talking about Ofsted, of course, Sir Martin Oliver's Outwood Grange School Trust was viewed very much as a CEO that turned around failing schools, schools that were forced to academise. But how? There was high levels of suspension, exclusion, young people put into isolation booths. That's not ensuring excellent education for all. Entrenches the social selection that we heard about in the previous panel.
So we've been converting schools that were struggling to academies for 20 odd years now, and there are endless examples of schools that have been transformed by that process. You can look at the best academy trusts like Star Academies, and you can see that they've done that over and over again. There are also plenty of examples of where it hasn't happened and a school has stayed underperforming. It's not magic doing it, but it has been the primary way that successive governments have changed the leadership of a school, and we don't have any other mechanism for doing that. So it's kind of what we have, and it's been effective in lots of cases. I don't think the change in the bill is a problem, because I don't think there was any particularly good reason for making it compulsory in that way in the first place. It was a kind of symbolic bit of legislation by the last government. Government have the power to do it. As Bridget Phillipson said yesterday, they will continue to do it in most of the cases where it would be done now. Having a little bit more flexibility is not a problem. What matters is how the government choose to use that power, not symbolically defining it in legislation.
Thank you. So the crisis in the system of support for children with special educational needs and disabilities is, I think, unarguably the biggest single crisis in the whole of the education system. And local authorities have told this committee that one of the challenges that they have is that there are very few levers that they can pull to deliver school places that are needed, particularly specialist places in their local area. So in that context, I wanted to ask what difference ending the presumption that all new schools should be academies will have to the ability of local authorities to deliver for children, and schools indeed, to deliver specialist places for children with special educational needs and disabilities. I might start the other way around with Sam.
I don't think it will make a huge amount of difference, because the issue is money. It's not who gets to open a school. Local authorities have, over the last decade or so, become pretty effective at identifying partners to open free schools with where there is resources to do that. But everybody has been reliant on government to provide the funding to open those schools, the capital funding to open those schools. If that capital funding is not available to local authorities, they're not going to be able to open schools, even if they now have the power to do so more quickly. That power always existed. There was a presumption for free schools, but if you could show there was no one willing to open a free school, local authorities could still build the school themselves. But again, the issue is just whether there are the resources to do it. You're absolutely right. There's a huge shortage of places in lots of parts of the country, and there is some money that has been made available for more places, but it's nowhere near enough, which goes to a much broader conversation about how you deal with the wider SEND crisis.
Thank you.
So I think ending the Academy's presumption will help alleviate the crisis in SEND provision. At the moment, there is an over-reliance on incredibly expensive private providers. I think last year, local authorities spent £2 billion on SEND places. And if you look at somewhere like Bournemouth, where there isn't a state-funded SEND provision at all, at the moment, and bear in mind they're one of the most indebted local authorities in the country, they're currently spending around £61,000 per pupil to be placed in private provision.
John, do you on that?
I mean, this goes back to what I was saying about the sort of next chapter of education in the country, that we've kind of got to break down some barriers and make education about partnership. It's got to be about what's right at a local level. And I think academies and local authorities working together, this is not a black or white conversation, there's not a right or wrong answer. It's about academies and local authorities working together on, you know, the incredible need and lack of capacity that we've got at a local level around special education needs. We know that an integrated provision where we keep, wherever possible, children with special education needs as close to mainstream education is the best deal for those children. It's not always possible, but wherever it is, I think that there's a lot going on around student numbers. There's buildings that are starting to have space in, and I think we need to be thinking about actually how do we work in partnership with local authorities and academies to use those spaces in the buildings to create the capacity and provision that we need at a local level. So I'm not sure the bill fixes or causes a problem around this, but I think, you know, this next chapter of education is the message that we need to be giving out to people.
Really briefly, Sam, on your point on this. So it is, of course, the case that local authorities have been able to work with Academy Trust providers to deliver new schools in some areas, but it's also been the case that organisations that want to set up new schools have been able to bid for that process. So do you think it's the case that the current system has optimised the strategic delivery of specialist places wherever they're needed across the country?
No, but I think that's because of the way that capital has been provided, not particularly because of who is opening the school. So the question is not who has the right to open the school, but it's how are you deciding to provide that very limited pot of capital? What process are you using? If there's a better process for doing that, then obviously that's going to help. But that is, I think, unrelated to the presumption per se, because it could always be overridden if you wanted to open a local authority school anyway.
Thank you. Manuela.
Yeah, should the bill include powers for Ofsted to inspect multi-academy trusts? Daniel?
Yes. Yes, to be honest. There is been a stream of stories of financial mismanagement in multi-academy trusts. UBAT in Brighton, quite significantly, 20% top slice being centralised. There are excessive levels of CEO pay at the moment, £500,000 one salary. There's a standalone trust in the West Midlands where I know it's one school and a CEO on £300,000. I know of another school, another trust where £90,000 was spent on providing Teslas for their senior leadership team. So yes, I think accountability at that top level would be welcome.
I mean, I think the question is, what are you inspecting, right? Firstly, it should be, if you're going to do this, it should be responsible bodies, not just multi-academy trusts. It should be local authorities as well, because they're also running the schools. But then the next question is, what are you inspecting? I wouldn't get Ofsted to be inspecting financial issues. There is already a lot of guidance and rules around what they do financially, and there is theoretically already a mechanism for doing it. Whether it works very well is another question, but Ofsted don't have any capability in financial administration. What they do is inspect educational provision, but there's nothing in any law, there's nothing in this bill or any previous bill that says multi-academy trusts have to do anything specific around education. So what are you looking at? If you say we're going to look at whether the multi-academy trusts or responsible bodies are providing a high standard of professional development for teachers in their schools, well, they're not legally required to do that. So by saying you're inspecting that, you're creating a new set of rules. which is fine as long as you're really clear on what you're doing and why, and that by doing an inspection framework you are for the first time actually setting out in any kind of documentation what it is that you want multi-academy trusts to do, and that's quite a significant shift in policy terms that we haven't had for the last 20 years.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there is already a degree of MAT inspection going on because all academies in a MAT are inspected by Ofsted. So there is a degree of inspection already happening around, particularly around obviously standards and safeguarding, some really key areas. We had a MAT inspection in 2015, and it was one of the first ones that happened, and it was clear that the purpose of the inspection wasn't clear, both for us as an organisation and also for the inspectors doing it. And then the skill set and capacity to actually inspect multi-academy trusts wasn't there at the time either, and I would question whether actually Ofsted have the skill sets and capacity at the moment to do that. I think the second thing I'd say is we're about to launch a new Ofsted framework in the country. My encouragement would be to get that done and launch successfully, and then think about what might be next. Think about that MAT bit after that. But I agree with Sam, it needs to be all responsible bodies. It can't just be, it would be a very odd thing to do, wouldn't it, just to inspect MATs and not inspect other responsible bodies.
Thank you. I just want to turn to the question of school improvement. The government is introducing RISE advisors as a kind of new mechanism for driving school improvement at the same time as they are removing default academisation as the route to achieving school improvement. Many of the newly appointed RISE advisors are, of course, from academies and academy trusts. How do you see the RISE teams complementing the existing levers for driving school performance? I might start with Daniel.
Well, we welcome the government's direction of travel around RISE teams. We think working with schools over time is a good and positive thing. But there is a bit of an elephant in the room. I think when we're talking about trying to improve standards. You know, we are. Have a school system that is in crisis at the minute. There's a recruitment and retention crisis, a crisis in workload, a crisis in funding. The bill broadly does really need to start to tackle these key issues.
John?
I think for a policy perspective, it creates an important mechanism for managing schools, because as we heard yesterday, the RISE teams, we look at the output of Ofsted and the accountability framework, the RISE teams are going to play a key role in supporting in old money RI schools to move forwards. The change from the department to one of more of a partnership model with schools in the sector is welcome, and that's what this represents. It represents a shift from just measuring to more of a focus on improving, and I think that's exactly what the department's role should be, and these RISE teams are the start of that. There are some real challenges, practical challenges in getting this going, as with all new initiatives. Capacity is a major challenge. I think we think about how do we as Oasis support this initiative. It's fantastic development opportunities for some of our staff, but equally we are staffed to run our schools at the moment, so we need to think about that capacity bit. And then the last thing is the accountability element of this. You've got a school that's struggling with a governing body, with a RISE team in, who is actually responsible for improving the school. I know what the paper will say, it'll be the school, but actually start to get a slightly murky world of, was the RISE team good enough to improve the school? Did they give the right advice and support to help the school move forwards or not? So there's some challenges to get over around the detail of how these teams are implemented. But I think fundamentally this idea of this strong partnership between the Department of Education and schools is welcome.
Sam?
I think it highlights a bit of a conceptual confusion over what the role of different players in the system is supposed to be. We have academy trusts and we have local authorities, and they are supposed to be the organisations, the responsible bodies for school improvement. If they're not improving the schools, then we should be regulating them to do that effectively, or in extreme circumstances not allowing them to do so at all. It seems odd for the department to say, okay, well, we'll do it as well. And that I think is where you're going to get sort of issues where John's pointing out where you've got an academy trust that has a school that is struggling in a couple of areas. They have a plan and a process and an approach for improvement. The RISE team have a different approach to improvement. Who wins in that discussion? What even happens? Is there a legal basis for the RISE team to impose a sort of a bespoke model, or can the Academy Trust say no, go away and leave us alone? So I think it does. Again, it goes to the fact that we need to have a slightly broader conversation than this bill allows about how the system functions and works, what's working well, what isn't. This feels like trying to fix a symptom rather than looking at the system as a whole.
Thank you. Caroline.
Thank you, Chair. We're going to turn now to talk about teachers' pay and conditions. So I'd like to first ask you all, what effect do you expect the bill's requirement on qualified teacher status and pay and conditions to have on recruitment and retention? And we'll start with Daniel.
So I think government should be unapologetic in wanting a qualified teacher for every school and for every young person. The fact of the matter is, I think multi-academy trusts have misused their supposed freedoms badly, to be honest, as we've seen excessive CEO pay go up. And actually, according to the DFE's own data, teachers in academies are paid around £700 a year less in primary and £600 a year less in secondary. We have a very deep and severe recruitment and retention crisis at the moment. For example, some of the big academy chains are hemorrhaging teachers. 27% of teachers left Harris last year. You cannot operate an education system like that. If every school had that sort of retention problem, the system would grind to a halt.
Thank you. Excuse me, John.
Cough as well. Yes, I agree with Daniel actually that we should have a high standard for a great teacher in every classroom. That's what we want to see. I think we are in a crisis. There are some real challenges around recruitment. There are some specific areas. If we look at some of the engineering, science, computing type areas, how we get people who might actually want to have that second career in teaching into teaching without too many barriers is a challenge, but I do agree that this QTS piece is important. I don't think this is the main issue around recruitment, though. I don't think the QTS bit is the problem. I think the offer, the employee value proposition, isn't good enough in the sector yet. They're just, we know we can't compete on pay, so we have to have flexibility in the terms and conditions. I think that is the only way, is to create an offer. We see a lot of women leaving the sector, because of the way that the school day is structured, and the flexibility in that doesn't allow people to return back to work in an easy way. And we can adjust that. It is within our power, and I think those standards should be extended to all schools.
And is there any inherent problem in the bill in that regard? I mean, the problem that the bill is seeking to fix are the schools that might pay a bit more but have less generous provisions in terms of sick pay and parental leave, and it's not trying to fix the problem of schools going above and beyond to retain their teachers.
No, I think if you'd asked me 2 weeks ago, I'd have said yes, it's a big problem. Now we've heard about the amendment that's going to be made. There's a floor set, which we welcome. Clearly we need more detail around what that floor is, and also how it will be funded to make sure that we can actually deliver that consistently. And I hope, if I'm honest, I hope it's a floor that keeps moving up, and is under review. And I'm sure Daniel would probably feel the same about this particular issue as well. So in terms of the bill itself, very supportive of the amendment that's been made. This is going to be a constant conversation we need to have as a sector.
So on QTS, I mean, I had a lengthy row with Dominic Cummings, which was always fun, in 2012, when the change was introduced the other way to allow. I was against doing it because I thought it was unnecessary and wouldn't be used, and it hasn't been. I mean, very, very few schools employ non-QTS teachers, and it's going down. So I don't think it's going to have an impact on recruitment, especially as if you did want to employ someone who had, from a sort of commercial sector, who didn't want to go through normal teacher training, you can do assessment only QTS. It's not particularly burdensome. So I'm not I'm not worried about that. I think since the amendment has been addressed the issue of pay, I am still a little bit worried about conditions, because we just don't know the detail yet on conditions and what the new rules will be that academies have to follow. There are rules that one could imagine that would be absolutely reasonable and fine and no one would object to. There are ones that could inhibit innovation around flexible working, around higher pay for different sets of responsibilities and things like that. And I think that's probably the worry that some trusts still have. But until we see the detail, it's hard to know. I haven't seen much evidence of a problem here, which again is sort of the frustration of this whole bill. There's been lack of explanation as to what it's trying to achieve.
Yeah.
Can I just make one more point,
course,
please, around the QTS? Because there's a bit of a narrative that academies should have freedom to appoint who they want, because they'll get David Beckham to teach PE. It's just not the reality. Some of the large trusts at the moment, and we're balloting at the moment one of the large trusts on this issue, are going out to the Caribbean. They're encouraging teachers to come to Britain with the promise of sponsoring a visa, with the promise of sponsoring them to go through QTS, and they are not delivering it. Meanwhile, the CEO is on hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds. It's the worst type of exploitation, and it's absolutely right that we move against it.
Thank you. So my supplementary question was that what impact do you think there will be on schools' ability to plug staffing gaps or bring in experience from other professions? And you've touched a little bit on that, but if any of you have anything extra you'd like to say, and whether you think academies should be restricted to have the same conditions as well as pay as the maintained sector.
I mean, just again on the QTS point, that it's working towards QTS. So you can bring someone in, like, as long as they're working towards QTS and there is assessment only QTS, it's really not very burdensome. So I cannot see it. I cannot see it being a blocker as long as schools are sensible about, and academy trusts are sensible about how they manage QTS.
Can I just pick up on one point? Just, and it might be your choice of words on that one, but you talked about academies being restricted. I think it needs to be the other way round. It's schools are restricted actually, and we need to unrestrict schools. So I think we need this floor in place, so that we've got a minimum standard for terms and conditions, and then we need to give people freedom to go above that to create the most competitive offer possible to actually solve this recruitment crisis. We cannot ignore pay as well. I know we can only go so far. If the sector does not maintain some sort of competitiveness around graduate pay, it is always going to be very hard to attract and retain staff, like any other organisation. So we need to push that as well as the terms and conditions bit.
I don't disagree with John actually in terms of teachers need to be fairly rewarded for the very difficult job that they do. But what we don't want to see is a rolling out of a system, what Sir John Coles is proposing, where you have a reduced pension but higher pay. I mean, the fact of the matter is wider terms and conditions have been eroded in many academy chains. Colton in Leeds has removed the daily sick pay from 100 days as the standard to 15 days a year. Dunraven Trust in Lambeth is cutting teachers' maternity rights by 38%. So, we want to see people, organisations spiralling up, not racing to the bottom, which is happening across many trusts at the moment.
Thank you. And moving on to the national curriculum, what impacts do you expect the provisions in the bill requiring academies to teach the national curriculum to have? Maybe we'll start with John on that one.
Well, we've got very little detail about what this actually looks like at the moment, but we don't. We're not worried about having a clear framework. I think if it gets very prescriptive to teaching circles on a Tuesday, then we're going to start to lose the power of relationship in a classroom, of a teacher being able to bring their own ideas, thoughts into that classroom to build that relationship with the students. We know that context is key. So again, a curriculum that constrains schools from actually delivering an education that meets the local context, that is able to actually meet the needs of all children in the classroom, is going to be a problem. We just don't have the detail at the moment around what the curriculum reforms look like. So if it's a sort of framework-esque approach, then we're pretty supportive of that. If it starts to be a very prescriptive model, then I think we'd say that's a step too far.
Thank you. Daniel.
So I agree very much with John. If we want to solve the recruitment and retention crisis, professional control, teacher autonomy has to be central to that. I think it's Sir Kevin Collins who recently said at the CST, that teachers are more downtrodden than they've ever been, being told what to do and when to do it. But actually, as I said previously, this is that freedom that some trusts put forward and portray just isn't the reality on the ground. The teachers are told what to do in a very prescriptive manner, and we do need to move away from that.
This is one of the bits of the bill where I'd really like to see it go in the other direction, and to give maintained schools the same freedoms that academies currently have. Because of the way our curriculum works, there's already quite a lot of control around it, because national assessments are driven by what's the content of the curriculum, and Ofsted are looking at whether you have a broad and balanced curriculum. So in practice, most schools will do most of the curriculum anyway, but just having that ability to deviate a little bit gives you a bit more control over your day, over you know better than the government what the needs of the children in your school are, and again I haven't seen any evidence that giving academies this freedom has caused any problems, and in some cases it's allowed them to just add a little bit of flexibility that's allowed them to support young people better. So I would have liked to see this one go the other way, or at least for there to be a clearer case as to why you do it this way.
In what circumstances does cooperation fail between schools and local authorities over admissions? What are the reasons for this, and do you think the bill's provisions on school admissions will make the system work better? John.
Sorry. So we follow local authority admissions at the moment because we believe in equity of offer, and we want to work in partnership. That isn't the case everywhere. I'm not judging other schools, but the system drives a type of behaviour. We're measured, our success is measured on outcomes, on Ofsted, and there's a behaviour measure in there as well, and that drives some schools to close their doors to some students. Now, in Oasis we are fully inclusive. That has a detrimental effect sometimes as well, because you become the school that is known for taking particular children. And my hope is that out of this policy we're going to get to a place where there is a fair distribution of children with special education needs, disadvantaged children, across all schools, so that all schools are truly inclusive, and therefore then all schools have the capacity then to meet the needs for all children. So I hope this will do some of that. There is a risk, particularly with falling student numbers, around the allocation of students to schools that we have in the back of our mind, but we think on the whole local authorities will act responsibly around this.
Daniel?
So too many multi-academy trusts have been abusing their admission powers to socially select pupils. I don't know if you're familiar with the research by Sutton Trust, but they found that 155 secondary comprehensives in England are now more socially selective than the average grammar school. And if you look at the top 500 schools by their Progress 8 metric, on average, these schools take 40% fewer pupils eligible for free school meals than comparison. Now, obviously, some of this is down to property prices, but when you don't take into account that, and young people living near top performing school, there's still very much unequal access. We need a system-wide approach, don't we, towards admissions that ensures that there is excellence for all, not some schools and young people off without SEND or free school meals need in one school and the more affluent in another.
I mean, the reason that academies were given control over their admissions in the first place was because of a concern, this was under the last Labour government, was because of a concern that local authorities would punish academies by that they didn't like, that had been essentially imposed on them as it was at that point, by sort of fixing admissions in a way that made life more difficult for them. I think that's much less of a challenge now that 80% of secondaries are academies and 40% are primaries. And I'm comfortable that allowing appeal to the schools adjudicator means that if it was still an issue, there's a mechanism for the academy to appeal and deal with it. I actually would have liked to see the bill go further and to say that local authorities set admissions policies. There's no good reason, other than that fear of them being punished, why academies would decide their own intakes. It's not, autonomy should be over what you do in the school, not over the children that you have in the school.
Can I just ask finally, we had the announcement yesterday of the proposed new reforms to the Ofsted inspection framework, which come midstream within the scrutiny of the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill. I just wondered if any of our witnesses wanted to comment on those reforms while you have the opportunity to do so this morning.
Let's go first.
I've spent the last year telling anyone who would listen to be careful what you wish for in terms of changing the Ofsted model. I don't think the problem with the previous model was that we had single word judgments and a single overarching judgment. I think that was actually quite helpful for parents. The problem has always been with Ofsted has been reliability of assessments. And this makes it harder because now you've got up to 11 different things that Ofsted are giving sub-judgments on, with no overarching grade, which allows you at least to aggregate the mistakes. So you're going to have less of a, there's going to be, if you had two teams of inspectors going into a school, they're more likely to say both are the same overall than they are to say one of 11 different things are the same. So I'm worried that this makes it harder for Ofsted to tackle its real issue, which is reliability and consistency of inspection, and doesn't actually deal with any of the concerns that schools has, and possibly makes it harder for parents to use them as well. So yeah, I have quite a lot of worries about this new model.
So very much agree with Sam. I mean, we have questions, we have long established questions around Ofsted's reliability. We now have 8 areas of measurement, 5 scale grade, that's 40 potential areas of judgment. Ofsted were tasked with bringing about a system of inspection that reduced pressure on the school system in quite tragic circumstances. It's our view that this will make things worse, not better. We've all got a shared challenge in regards to the crisis in recruitment and retention, Ofsted included, and it's our fear that this will drive more teachers and school leaders out of the profession.
Well, I've got 2 Ofsted inspections happening today and tomorrow at the moment, so it continues to be a fairly high stakes piece. There's no perfect system here. I think the things that matter is how inspectors conduct themselves during the inspection more than anything, and I think we have seen a notable shift in that since the Ruth Perry tragedy, that there is much more care going on by inspectors, much more asking how people are, what support's in place for leaders, so that's very welcome. The 9 areas of measure are complex. It does create a complexity. I think parents will get their heads around that. We will get our heads around that, and we will start to learn to operate within that system. I think the big question is that when you inspect something, when you design something, you drive types of behaviour. So I think we need to be careful to monitor how this framework, what the behaviours are that this framework drives into school and school practice, particularly in all the other things we've been talking around admissions and attendance and re-inspections and the RISE teams. And actually, it's probably something that we want to keep under review. I would have thought, set a sort of 2-3 year, say let's launch this in 2-3 years time, have another review and see whether it's working or not, and then improve it.
Thank you very much. Can I thank you all for coming to give your evidence to us this morning? We'll just pause while we invite our third panel. Thank you. Can I welcome our third and final panel of witnesses this morning? Can I start by putting on record an interest that I should have put on record at the start of the meeting in relation to Bev Craig's attendance, that I am a Vice President of the Local Government Association. And can I invite our witnesses firstly to introduce yourselves to us, starting with Bev Craig.
So good morning, I'm Vice Chair of the Local Government Association, Councillor Bev Craig. I'm also the leader of Manchester City Council.
Hello, I'm Claire Canning. I'm a home ed mum to 2 teenage girls, and I'm a volunteer director of Broadleaf Home Ed Co-op in the New Forest.
Hello, I'm Tom Brooke. I'm Joint Interim Chief Adjudicator for Schools.
Thank you very much. Can we go to Manuela for the first question?
Thank you. And Chair, I need to declare as well, I'm a local councillor, though district, no county. So the first question is for Claire. What are the benefits of a home education from your perspective?
So from my perspective, home education is the most bespoke child-centred education that you could give a child. For my own children, they have very diverse needs. My youngest has quite complex SEND needs. So for us, home education has allowed us to provide an education for her which specifically meets her needs and her age, ability. Home ed is such a broad... I feel that there's a misunderstanding of what home education is. My perspective is that home education may be curated at home, but actually it's provided in the community with other people, with families, with community at the core. And I think bringing people together in that way is immensely powerful. So home education benefits not just the child, which is at the centre of the education that they're being provided, but also their family, their wider family, the wellbeing and the support networks that they're offered.
Thank you. And obviously you mentioned children with special educational needs and disability. What particular benefits have these children for if they undertake a home education?
So at Broadleaf we have about 120 children each week come to us for a variety of activities and opportunities. The vast majority of those do have special educational needs or have experienced bullying and harm in their time at school. So home education provides an opportunity for us to give them a very different experience, so they are able to have their needs met. So we have one particular child who isn't able to sit still, but he can spin. So we have, because of our high ratio of adults to children, we have really inclusive spaces where all children are welcomed and supported. And all of the adults there are highly invested. None of us are paid for what we deliver. We are parents of our own children, providing exceptional opportunities for our own children and for others. And those children with additional needs, I'm autistic, my daughter is autistic. I know what I would have needed when I was at school, so taking my own experience and those of the many families I've worked with over the last 15 years has enabled us to shape a really bespoke education for those children which is suitable for their particular needs. And we have the flexibility. Home education is incredibly reflexive and responsive, so we're able to meet the needs of those children as they change.
You mentioned obviously children with special needs and disability, children who have been bullied in the mainstream school system. Are there any other groups of children who benefit from the flexibility of a home-based environment?
Absolutely. My personal belief is that every child could benefit from education curated from home, but there are specific groups, for example, children who may have a lot of uncertainty at home, maybe they're passing through foster care. Having home education provided can give them some sense of continuity and stability rather than moving. Other children that we've had in the community have parents who are maybe in the armed forces with a lot of moving around. Having that consistency of education can give those children a lot more stability. But yeah, there's a wide range of children who can benefit from this, and it really is an education with children at the core, which is the most important part. You know, there's no one more invested in our children's education than the parents of those children who put everything into it. So there's a lot of groups, but I do believe every child could benefit from home education.
I just wondered, did you want to provide a local authority perspective?
Yes, so I think that there are, of course, many wonderful examples of where children being homeschooled can help them flourish. I suppose from my perspective, though, from a local government perspective, I think we do really welcome something that we've been calling for a long time in this bill around the provisions of having the nationally kind of mandated register that would mandate the ability to work together to inspect kind of the provision that's being delivered, but also just recognising that people do come from different places and different perspectives, and that often homeschooling might not be to every child's needs. I think through the growth that we've seen in home education, I do think we probably need to consider what modern safeguards would look in that context. You know, we're seeing in a Manchester perspective, for example, the growth of AI-generated packages of education at home, and I do think the bill needs to think about, in addition to children in need registers, sort of thinking about actually how do we regulate that a little bit more in terms of what's appropriate. I suppose I would just reflect that we've seen increasing demands across education in the last decade, and we know, and it's well documented, that many of our children and young people with SEND are often underserved in the education system. So I do think we need to consider it from the perspective that we need to make education broadly more accessible, and do more to reduce permanent exclusions and do more to help keep children and young people in school, recognising that homeschooling won't work for everyone. So I think just from a local government perspective, we welcome many of the requests that have been put forward in the bill. And I would reflect, so from a City of Manchester perspective, we already do a lot of proactive work. We already go out and check where we can the environments that children are at home when it comes to homeschooling and being off register. We don't have the ability to mandate that. So the example I would give is our professionals believe it's very important to be able to see the child in the home. At the moment, without the measures in the current bill, a parent could meet us voluntarily in a coffee shop. Now, you don't get to see the same environment as to what they're going in home. So I think it is an area that needs more regulation, and I would welcome the provisions being put forward in the bill, particularly around homeschooling, to enable us as local authorities to make sure that we're doing our very best to make sure that we're supporting every child and that every child's needs are met.
Thank you. So I've got another question for you, Claire. So the bill places a responsibility on local authorities to support parents who have decided to home educate their children. What support do you think it would be helpful to receive from local authorities? And as a supplementary, so might guide your answer a little bit, what support do you think could be provided to enable children who are home educated to sit public examinations more easily? So the exams, but also generally what support do you think would be helpful?
So I think that really is the key word, support, rather than punitive measures. I do really want to come back to the point that you made about homes being educational environments, that they are not provision, they are not educational provision, they are private family homes, which is why we have this real issue. So I would like to see local authorities moving towards a more supportive approach that understands home education. For example, at Broadleaf, we have a number of children who the local authority have not been able to place anywhere else, who have come to us at Broadleaf. We are chosen by the local authority on many an occasion. Local authorities, with particular reference to exams, that's one of the most difficult things for home educators to access. There are very few private exam centres in the country, and the ones that do exist, for example, Devon and Cornwall have no exam centres at all. So families quite often have to travel long distances to Somerset or beyond, incurring both the cost of exams, which can be anywhere from £180 to £600 per exam, on top of the travel and accommodation expenses. So if there was a duty on local authorities to provide access to exam centres, that would be excellent. Further to that, a lot of the exam centres we do have don't provide access to the access arrangements that this cohort of children need. The vast majority, or a majority, have special educational needs and will require some access arrangements. So a duty on local authorities to be able to provide those as well would be excellent. On top of that, it's much more difficult as a home educator to access diagnosis and support with organisations like CAMS, so extra support there, maybe access to an educational psychologist or a SENCO to support those children would be really good.
Do you think it's appropriate that in a situation like Broadleaf, where you are guiding children towards GCSEs, that they don't have access to GCSEs unless the parents can afford to pay? I mean, the state isn't paying for them to be educated in one of their schools. It seems rather unfair that then the parents have to pay for them to sit exams.
Yes, it is definitely a feeling within the wider community that it is unfair that we are saving the government money by providing our education at home and then also having to pay for the exams which would have been provided to school children at no cost. So absolutely, yes, it feels unfair and discriminatory to not have access to those things in the same way that school children would.
I think many people would be quite surprised that home educated children don't have access to exams.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. This question is to Claire. Local authorities will be required to collect information from parents and others, such as yourselves, who provide home education. What would be the least burdensome but also effective way of collecting this information?
So local authorities already do this. So there is a duty on local authorities to contact parents and all of the families I'm aware of will have annual contact with their local authority and will provide a retrospective report, sometimes written, sometimes in person, however works for that family the best. So being able to provide information that way gives a really holistic sense of what your child has been up to, and you can share that with the local authority. The bill is causing deep concern across the community. We're all parents, we're majority mothers, already very, very busy with what we're doing, educating our children. And the bill proposes that we have to provide details of changes to our local authority within 15 days, which feels completely unworkable. And I think really speaks to a significant misunderstanding of what home education is. I don't know of any children who sit at home with one provider doing studies at their dining table all day long. Home education is out in the world. You know, if we're having to provide details of those changes, that could be, you know, on a Monday, that could be sports coaches, that could be after school clubs, that could be museum workshops, that could be a whole variety of things. And estimates seem